program with relevant guest hosts interviewing top nonfiction authors about their latest work.
Well, great to be with you, Michelle. I would love to get ready to talk about your book, Open Borders, Inc.
Thank you.
First part of your book really captured my attention because something that's important to me as a congressman from Texas is the extent to which cartels have operational control of our border. I've been to the border numerous times, and I'd love to get your perspective on that. The $2 million a week that the Reynosa faction of the Gulf Cartel is making, just moving people across in McAllen. You know this well. It's a real problem. They're the ones profiteering on the back of migrants and women and children. And can you talk a little bit about that as one of the opening points you make in your great book?
You're right, Congressman. The work that you are doing is so important to enlighten the American public about the vice grip that the cartels have at the border, the horrifying and appalling impact that has to innocent people on both sides of the border. And one of the things that I think was really important to illuminate in chapter 1 of the book of what I call the caravan cartel is that the drug cartels couldn't do it alone. And I think what's shocking to people is not that you have explicit criminal conspirators out there that are making these billions of dollars in profits and endangering lives and really wreaking violence and havoc on innocent families and children. But the fact that you have minted benevolent charities and religious organizations that may think that they're doing good deeds. And of course, we all know about the kind of road that good intentions pave. But religious organizations on both sides of the border that are doing service and enabling the drug cartels to make as much cash as they do. We've seen the illegal alien caravans come across from Central America up the spine of Mexico into your state and then beyond. And the support money that is subsidizing this entire illegal alien shelter network, especially churchgoers in America need to understand, is largely coming from their own pockets into collection plates. They think it's helping their neighbors. They think it's helping homeless people in their communities. But in many ways, it's going straight to that network. And I name many of the shelters from Central America all the way into the interior of the United States that are being subsidized, for example, by the Catholic Church and every sect therein, the Jesuits, the Scalabrinians, and in concert with non-governmental organizations like Doctors Without Borders that are creating those magnets and those pull factors that the drug cartels then exploit.
Well, Michelle, you're making a great point here, and what I'd love to explore a little bit further is the extent to which there's a cycle of human smuggling, and the extent to which cartels are at the central, operational control of that cycle. And to your point about then how it works. So a lot of people, I think, don't understand the extent to which you've got people who are being driven up from countries by cartels and illicit organizations for profit. One report I saw was $2 billion for cartels for the profit they were making moving people, not narcotics, but people, to get across our country. And then the way they do it is by exploiting our laws, and then the asylum laws and the Flores catch and release situation that I know you know a lot about. And they come across our border, and then what you find is you go to the border, people are being brought across, they go straight to a bus, get processed by Border Patrol, and then get brought straight to an NGO to then get distributed into the country. And all of this is completing the cycle of smuggling. Can you talk a little bit about that and the exploitation of our laws and how that all comes together?
Well, the question it hits the nail on the head because, your average news consumer, even if they're fairly well informed, has the impression that the people at the border are trying to evade the Border Patrol. Right. And that's not true. They're marching right up to the station because they've been coached, not just like along the route to there, but of course they're hearing it on the radio in their home countries. The word spreads very fast and quickly. And of course, we know now in your state, you see that it's not just Central America. All of these African migrants as well have been coached. And I think what's alarming, Congressman, is that these people around the world are far more informed about immigration law and all the ins and outs, the nuts and bolts, how to work around all the loopholes, and in many cases it's not the loopholes, it's actually, how it works, than the American people are about the rules and laws that are on our books that are supposed to protect us. And so, you've got the illegal alien parents that are already here. Maybe they got temporary protected status 25 years ago when there was an earthquake in El Salvador. Temporary is never temporary in the world of open borders. Or they have extended relatives. And then they've got the children back home that they pay a coyote to bring across, and the coyote pays the drug cartels to give them the final passage, and everybody's making money. And then you have these NGOs, as you mentioned, who get their own cut of the profits. And I think what's most offensive to people who really understand the way this works is that, in essence, this is a global human smuggling racket, and they get to operate under the patina and umbrella of compassion, while they accuse all the rest of us of being xenophobes, racists, heartless, whatever. The question always comes up about who we are, right? The existential question. And they wrap themselves in the mantle of the flag and the Statue of Liberty, which the last time I checked was not in the Constitution of the United States or any of the U.S. code that deals with immigration law, but has been exalted as such. And even if you look at the Statue of Liberty, it has the phrase liberty enlightening the world, not liberty absorbing and resettling the entire world.
Well, I think that you raised a lot of important points there. And before I move to one different topic, I want to close the loop on the consequences of all of this. You mentioned the humanitarian reality of what we're dealing with. The impact on American citizens, endangerment. I have a citizen in San Antonio, Texas, Jared Vargas, who was unfortunately murdered last summer, was thankfully just the person who perpetrated that crime, an illegal immigrant who had been caught, released, was just prosecuted for that and found guilty. But this is a reality in America. It's harming American citizens, but also the migrants who seek to come here who are abused, right? The women, the children on journeys while these illicit, illegal organizations profit. And then you said the important part there about compassion, right? To me, this is the false name of compassion, that open borders is somehow good for migrants, is completely backwards. It's empowering these illegal organizations. And again, you talk about these kinds of things in your book, and so I'd love to hear your point on that before we move on to a different chapter.
I agree with you. The massive systemic exploitation of innocent people who want what we all want, better lives for themselves and their children, it breaks my heart. And the number of pawns in this really cruel and inhumane game of Open Borders, Inc. is incalculable. And the fact that it doesn't just stop at the borders. I lived in the D.C. swamp area and Montgomery County, which has long prided itself on being an illegal alien sanctuary space. And when I left here 11 years ago, you could already see the signs of MS-13 taking over the public schools, taking over the local malls. It's only metastasized and gotten worse. And I think it's incredibly important to point out that it's not just American citizens that are victims of these crimes, but it is largely other members of these migrant communities who are being victimized, raped, and murdered.
Well, thanks for making that point. And that I'm going to get to the next topic that I think was really caught my eye in your book. I'm going to say something that's going to shock you and the viewers. I'm a white guy. and I'm a bald white guy. And in chapter 4 of your book, though, is titled Hate Machine, the Southern Poverty Law Center. And you start, and I'm looking at the exact quote, without getting into the weeds, here's what you say. You identify yourself as, quote, a non-white, brown-skinned daughter of Filipino Catholic immigrants, the wife of a grandson of Ukrainian Jewish migrants, the mother of multiracial, multi-ethnic children. And then you start pointing out the things that you are not. Xenophobic, racist, white supremacist. Yet these are always the charges. I just love to hearing where some of my Democrat colleagues were accusing the former head of ICE, Tom Homan, who is a lifetime law enforcement officer defending our borders and enforcing our laws. They called him a bigot. You see this all the time. And could you speak to that from your perspective and what you've gone through in your life and why you take particular offense to that?
Yes, and I want to go back to my very first appearance on C-SPAN in 2002 when I came out with my very first book. invasion, and it was on the first year anniversary of the September 11th terrorist attacks. We are talking to each other, of course, on the 18th anniversary of those attacks. And it was because of the love of country that my immigrant, naturalized American parents inculcated in me that fueled me to write that book. And now, you know, at 17 years later, coming back to this topic and really fleshing out the global financing of this immigration chaos. The idea that you have an entire infrastructure that is hell-bent on demonizing and smearing every immigration enforcement advocate, every group out there that does the research and tells the truth about the negative impacts on our culture, on our schools, on our public health system and welfare, let alone national security. It's really daunting because you realize these aren't just random people out there tossing out these smears. It is very well orchestrated and it is very well funded. And in large part, it's coming from groups that enjoy tax-exempt nonprofit status. So the chapter that I wrote on the Southern Poverty Law Center starts out the way that you read because I encountered that smear machine very early on. Now everybody is aware of it with the large number of deplatformings that we're seeing of prominent conservatives, independents, Trump supporters, and other organizations that have found success on the internet. But very early on, it was immigration that motivated groups like the National Council of La Raza, the Anti-Defamation League, and a number of subgroups under the umbrella of the Open Society Foundation to come up with their own guidebook, right? A book of code words that you're not allowed to use. And for me, in 2006 or 2007, there was a video that had attacked me for talking about the academic concepts of Azatlan and Reconquista, the idea that demographically, if many of these open borders forces were able to overwhelm cities, that they would amass electoral power. And all you have to do is look at the numbers and see that that's happening. But to be able to talk about it without being labeled a conspiracy theorist is nearly impossible these days. And it certainly helps the SPLC, which itself is a highly discredited organization that even mainstream liberals and magazines like The Atlantic have completely exposed. Now you've got internal whistleblowers who have talked about harassment and racial discrimination within the organization. The Poverty Palace should no longer be quoted by any mainstream media organization, and yet CNN and the Washington Post continue to confer upon it absolute moral authority to be able to judge who is a quote-unquote white supremacist, even if they have as brown skin as I do.
Well, I wonder, you've spent a lot of time down on our southern border, and I have as well, obviously. The district I represent, the 21st Congressional District, which stretches from Austin to San Antonio, out through the Hill Country, out to Real County, which is about 100 miles from the Rio Grande along the Laredo sector. And so I've spent a lot of time in Laredo. I've spent a lot of time in McAllen. You have too, right? You've been to the border.
Yes, I have, many times.
Right, and you've been to the border in Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California, and I wonder if your perspective is the same as mine. I mean, it is often brought out, this charge that there's a racist tinge to believing in border security. And I have two thoughts on that, and I want to get your feeling on it, which is, one, look at the brave men and women at Border Patrol who are overwhelmed right now, who, as one agent told me, is often on diaper patrol instead of border patrol because they're so overwhelmed. As other agents have said, they're often in a sector where they only have 3 guys or gals on the line trying to protect a 70-mile stretch, that they'll have a 2-mile stretch of 70 miles in Laredo where you can drive a car alongside the river, that you can't see the river through the cane, that you don't have a radio signal, you don't have a cell signal. We're asking them to do the impossible. Here's my point. The majority of the Border Patrol officers that I've engaged with, and I believe it is statistical truth, are Hispanic. And they're Hispanic Americans who are along the border who believe that border is part of our sovereignty and that the rule of law matters and that that's why people seek to come here. So that'd be one point. And the second point is, with respect to this, the racist charge, how is it somehow good for people of any color to be abused on a journey coming here and have open borders that then empowers the very illegal organizations we discussed earlier in the show And how is that a good thing from a race standpoint at all? And I wonder if you have thoughts on either of those 2 points.
Yeah, on the first point, I absolutely agree with you. And I cut my teeth in newspaper journalism in Los Angeles in the early 1990s. And not only did I report on the perspective of American citizens and law-abiding immigrants who were early warning about immigration chaos in that state and trying to take control of it back then, but of course had started building up many sources, both in the Border Patrol and ICE. Then I moved up to the Seattle Times and was able to see the perspective of Border Patrol agents and deportation and removal officers who worked on the northern part of the border. You know, we spend so much time justly talking about the southern border, but the neglect at the northern border, especially when you have Canadian governments in power who see themselves as doormats for the world, and in large part harboring Islamic extremist groups that then can just traipse across the northern border because all that's stopping them are orange rubber cones. It's alarming, and they've been under siege for a long time. Congress and the Washington swamp always pay lip service to wanting to fund them more, wanting to increase their ranks, but they have been purposely turned into, as you say, a diaper patrol because too many special interests don't want them to do their jobs effectively. And another important point you made, of course, is that these Border Patrol agents come from all backgrounds, and they have all skin colors: brown, white, black, yellow. Many, of course, in the southern border sectors are families that come from law-abiding Hispanic families themselves. In Colorado, my adopted home state, I visited the Aurora ICE facility recently, and the ICE agents there and the other people that work there from the private contractor, many of them are, proud and recently naturalized Americans who understand that to preserve that special gift of being able to become an American, you need an orderly system that's able to vet properly and decide who we want to let in, who should stay here, and how we should remove the people who don't belong here in the first place.
Well, Michelle, I was about to move to business and to move to your Open Borders Inc., but I can't resist commenting on the Aurora situation. You'll remember I was in Colorado, and I saw you the weekend that a group of folks stormed that ICE facility in Aurora, turned the American flag upside down, put, abolish ICE on it, and then raised the Mexican flag. And I went to that facility that Saturday morning, the day after that occurred. And you and I talked about this, that I went in there and I found 1,200 people. I found clean rooms. I found TVs. I found iPads. I found 3 square meals a day. I found, internet access, gyms. But here's the interesting point to your point. There were people in that facility from 57 countries. 57 countries from around the world. Eritrea, Pakistan, India, Indonesia, right? This is not just a Northern Triangle and problem with respect to Mexico, is it?
No, it's not. It's worldwide. And yes, I remember when you tweeted the picture of you outside of that Aurora facility. It inspired me to do more in my own home state. And not long after, on Labor Day, just recently, we had a Stand with ICE rally that drew 200 people on a holiday. There is a hunger and a thirst among grassroots ordinary citizens to show their support in a way that hasn't been done until now. And with so many of these ICE facilities under siege, being lied about, with the agents being doxxed and harassed, which I talk about in the book in chapter 5 on what I call the A-Team, Abolish ICE, Antifa, and the Sanctuary Anarchists. Again, this is well subsidized and underwritten by forces that are hostile to American sovereignty. And it is very important for people to know what's actually going on in the facilities. So the tour that you took, the tour that I took, I was stunned, Congressman, to find out that among the many amenities that you listed, on top of that, you've got these detainees, many, of course, of them still, criminal, alien, repeat offenders and deportation fugitives who have free access to LexisNexis. They have telepsychiatry appointments, full-service pharmacy. I've been to Colorado State Department of Corrections facilities that don't have a fraction of these amenities. And yet, if you believe the hysteria-driven squad
right.
here in the Beltway. They are on the order of concentration camps from World War II. This is absolutely ridiculous, and you know, more disturbingly, the incitement to violence is not just some sort of speculation. And you would think that with all of the targets that have now faced either shootings like the shots that were fired in San Antonio, the Molotov cocktail throwing at the CIS office in Florida, and obviously the attack by the Antifa thug in Tacoma. If you know, if the ideological chips had fallen on the other side, this would be declared an epidemic, and there would be congressional hearings out the wazoo about how to prevent this epidemic of violence from continuing.
Well, you make a great point, and I'll add just one more point to that about the ICE facilities. One consequence, right, of the massive influx, the almost 900,000 people who have been apprehended since last October 1, that's not counting those not apprehended, as you know, 600,000 of them have been caught and released. But a huge number that we've got to find a place to put them. Where are they going? They're going to ICE facilities. And so when I was at the facility in Aurora, what I was told was that 80% of those 1,200 were people who had come across our southern border recently. Well, what does that mean? To your point about criminals, we're not being able to do as much interior enforcement because we don't have a place to put them. And by interior enforcement, as you know, and I wonder if you want to comment on this, we're talking about hardened criminals, dangerous people, engaging in you know, battery or assault or murder or whatever it might be. And so we're having a tougher time actually doing our job interior because they're all overwhelmed. Border Patrol is overwhelmed, ICE is overwhelmed.
It's such a trenchant point, Congressman, and I wish we could just shout it from the rooftops every single day. The problem is that, you know, when we talk about the policy consequences, these are hidden costs. You know, it's not like a viral photo of Yanela Sanchez that you can Photoshop onto a Time cover.
Right.
You know, and the left, of course, exploits this ability to tell these visceral stories, but we can't tell the stories of the hidden impact of other types of victims of crime that we can't know about, and the displacement in places like the Aurora ICE facility of hardened criminal repeat aliens, like you say, with these people who are being, you know, surged across the border and enabled by all of these NGOs and this entire Open Borders Inc. network that I've exposed. You know, I moved away from Montgomery County to Colorado thinking I was escaping it. And, you know, the salient point for everyday Americans across the country is there's no safe space from Open Borders, Inc.
Well, you couldn't be more right. Mayor of Uvalde, Texas, a small town west of San Antonio, came up and did a press conference with me up here in San Antonio up here in D.C., sorry, because of the dangers that are now posed to the people in Uvalde, just, you know, 50, 60, 70 miles from the border. We're having real impact for folks, but it's in Colorado. It's in Montgomery County, your former home. We're seeing all sorts of terrible things and consequences and abuses by people who are coming here illegally from the Northern Triangle. So I'm glad you made that point, but I do think we should pivot to big business. You know, your book is titled Open Borders, Inc. There's obviously a correlation and a tie to the business community. You know, one of the things that I have said before is that I think we should be wrong. It's wrong for us to stand on the Rio Grande with a no trespassing sign, but then kind of wink, wink, nod, nod, hold up a help wanted sign. And we do that a lot in this country, and I think we need to have a robust conversation about what's actually going on. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because you do in your book. You talk about big business and Amazon and how that plays into all of this.
Yeah, in fact, most of the Silicon Valley overlords have their own vested interest. It's not merely virtue signaling. If it was simply empty virtue signaling to, you know, spread money around to the racist project in Texas that provides pro bono legal services to illegal alien family members, you know, I suppose then the problem wouldn't be so intractable. But for a lot of these Silicon Valley companies, and I wrote about this as a focus of my last book, Sold Out, with John Miano, who was a former American software programmer turned lawyer for American IT workers who've been harmed by these cheap labor pipelines for IT workers from China and India. Their explicit goals are to bring in as many cheap laborers as they can, who then outsource the work. So the problem, of course, is that a lot of these Silicon Valley companies have invited the SPLC into their inner chambers to help them identify their worst political opponents and then to deplatform them and completely throttle them from telling the truth. And it's connecting the dots of that money. I mean, Tim Cook and Jeff Bezos have donated to many of these deep-pocketed nonprofit organizations that are crusading for illegal alien rights. You wonder how it is that they have instant representation in court to sue over every last Trump initiative to enforce the law. And so, big business and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce are a huge reason for that.
Well, let me ask your perspective on this, because as you know, I've been working in this universe for a while. When I was on the Hill in the Senate Judiciary Committee 14, 15 years ago, 12, 13 years ago, then again as Senator Cruz's chief of staff, and now as a member of Congress. And also when I was in the Attorney General's office, we litigated DAPA through the Fifth Circuit and up to the United States Supreme Court, trying to enforce the law. It has struck me that the circle that we find ourselves in is significantly a part of the Chamber of Commerce sort of business crowd that wanted to tamp down any effort to have a sensible border security solution. One like, for example, Democrat Sylvester Reyes in El Paso supported with Operation Hold the Line, building a fence in El Paso that would work. And now his successor, Beto O'Rourke, wants to tear that down. We know that border security needs some sort of infrastructure and fencing. Southern California, we had 600,000 and something annual apprehensions in the mid-1990s. That number's down to about the 30,000s. Why? Triple-layer fencing. This is not rocket science for most Americans. We can have a rational border policy from Brownsville all the way to El Paso in Texas and out to the Pacific. My concern and my question for you is, why do we end up in an endless cycle with some interest, not all, particularly bigger business or bigger representation, U.S. Chamber in D.C., not wanting us to actually enforce the law?
Well, money talks. And I think that a lot of local Chamber of Commerce members have no idea what the National Chamber of Commerce actually represents. And I think most of these grassroots local members would be appalled to know that. And it would be one thing, again, if we could just point fingers at Beto or Julian Castro and say, whoa, they're really out there. They want to decriminalize border trespassing, and they're talking about this seriously. They really do want to abolish ICE and not replace it with anything else. But lurking behind them, of course, are these larger corporate interests that allow the crazies and the radicals to give voice to the ultimate working agenda of their own organizations. I mean, they will be very happy if every last willing worker in the world is able to cross the border for dollar an hour wages.
Well, let me ask you this on a related point, and we're talking about business community and free trade, right, is really important in Texas, and NAFTA, and having free flow of goods and services across the border to Mexico. My observation is you've got a burgeoning and growing middle class in Mexico because of NAFTA and getting free trade, and that our goal and objective as a society ought to be to have an encouraged economic growth throughout the Western Hemisphere, Mexico, the Northern Triangle. We want that to occur. We want to decrease the pressure valve for people to come here. But isn't part of that is the economic situation and making sure we stand up for free trade? I would note that Nancy Pelosi is blocking the president's goal of getting USMCA done because she doesn't want to give him a victory. But why don't we also recognize that enforcement in order to stop the magnet for people coming across is part of that? In other words, it's better for Mexico, better for Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, better for Venezuela and all in South America, for us to have a secure border where everybody knows what the rules are. They're welcome to come here through the open doors, and then that would actually result in better lives for the people in other countries. I
agree with you. And so the formulation is basically that interior enforcement and enforcement of our own borders is empowering to the people in these home countries to create more wealth in their own countries and to convince them to take more accountability for their own homes. But no, we're just racist for believing that the best way for people to improve their lives and prosperity is to not have to risk their own kids' lives and enrich drug cartels and all of these NGOs. And here again, the financial imperative comes into play. I have a section in Chapter 1 called Banking on Illegals, where I talk specifically about all the financial institutions from Wells Fargo to Bank of America, or Bank of Illegal Aliens in America, I suppose. Now there are all these apps, and PayPal is in on it, and a lot of the Silicon Valleys, to be able to more seamlessly send remittances back home. We have President Trump, who has vowed and promised and signaled and telegraphed that he's going to start taxing the billions of remittances that are sent back to Mexico and the rest of the world. Hasn't done it yet. And shockingly, I think for most people, although I know you know this, and people who have followed these issues know, the Federal Reserve itself runs a remittance program called Directo a Mexico, where it recruits illegal alien customers in America by throwing festivals and having carnival games for the children of illegal aliens to sign them up so that they can get a cut too.
Well, one of the things that I think grabbed my attention in your book is a little bit about talking about the media. And I think you referred to what some of the media personalities have done to create a climate of hate. So kind of extending from what we've already been talking about a little bit there, can you talk a little bit about that and how that's impacting the whole conversation right now with respect to how we actually solve the problem in a rational and sane way, believing in sovereignty, believing in free trade, believing in, as people of faith, wanting to help people who need help, but believing the best way to do that is to have a system that works, where the law is enforced, and where it isn't this open borders, wink, wink, that actually harms people because they're being controlled by dangerous cartels. Can you talk a little bit about how the media is fomenting that wrongly?
Yes. So it is incredibly difficult to talk rationally about policy consequences when you have open borders propagandists in the media constantly smearing patriots as hatriots and seizing control of the absolute moral authority card, to confer essentially this moral authority only on illegal aliens and their families at the expense of American families who've been separated. That never ever comes up. And actually, I wrote a column this week about questions that I know that the open borders media are not going to ask these Democrat presidential candidates. Questions like, the debate is in Houston, right? Houston, which is a sanctuary space where Jocelyn Johnson lost her husband, both of them members of the Houston Police Department. Right. And she does not have standing in American courts to be able to sue to hold the sanctuary anarchists accountable. Where are the bleeding hearts on the left for families like this? She and her husband are both African American. And there's so many stories like that. And yet you have an open borders media that when President Trump finally embraced many of these angel families and told their stories during the State of the Union, these media types on Twitter were proactively smearing them, sneering at them while they were being applauded in the chamber. They have absolute contempt for American citizens while they exalt every last supposed victim of the illegal immigration racket, and in many cases lie. I talk about the straight out narrative deception. We talked about Yanela Sanchez, many cases like that, and it certainly doesn't help that you have outright illegal aliens in the media like Jose Antonio Vargas, who's been supported by Soros money, out there calling himself a real American, obliterating the very fundamental difference between people who came here legally, like my parents did from the Philippines, and people like him who came here illegally from the Philippines.
Well, I'm really glad that you mentioned what you are talking about with respect to Houston and some of the sanctuary problems that we have. I mentioned earlier Jared Vargas, who was unfortunately murdered last July in San Antonio. Gotten to know his wonderful mom, Lori, his family, his Aunt Kristen, his whole family, his brother, and they're a wonderful family. And they're just blown away by the state of our laws. And they're really hurt, right? They lost a loved one. And what I'll hear from some critics will say, well, there are crimes that are committed by American citizens. They try to play percentages about who does more. My point is very simple. That doesn't do anything to bring Jared back for Lori, right? And this is somebody who is here who wasn't supposed to be here. By the way, the 900,000 people that came across our border, 600,000 caught and released, we're not performing adequate screening. And if even only 1% of those people are coming in are bad people and associated with MS-13 or gangs, that's a lot of people, right? That's 9,000 people.
Yeah.
And so I wonder can you talk a little bit more about the angel families, the direct impact on American citizens? And then one last point, a lot of people don't know the stash houses and the abuses that continue. We found a stash house, we meaning the United States government, in Houston, with 54 people in a basement being held hostage to pay ransom back to cartels on the other side of the Rio Grande. That's real. That's happening in America. Can you talk about these things?
Yeah, I think the most important thing you talked about there, which is a point that I always try to stress, and I have over the last 25 years that I've been covering these issues. Yes, the open borders propagandists will go back and forth about, whatever the proportion of criminal. The 100% of the criminal aliens committed crimes that were 100% preventable. And if the gun control lobby applied, its own "if it saved just one life" mantra to immigration control, we'd be so much better off. And this revolving door, of course, has victimized so many people. We've talked about it before. It's not just American citizens, but people of all races and backgrounds. And the callousness with which the media and Hollywood, especially, I have a whole entire chapter on that too, the intersection between Hollywood and Open Borders, Inc. The callousness with which they show, in particular, families of color, to borrow their own phraseology, is stunning to me. And I contrasted the outpouring of compassion for Yanela Sanchez by Hollywood, the media, and elected Democrats in California to the near code of silence there was when Ronil Singh, this hero legal immigrant of Indian descent from Fiji, was ruthlessly murdered on Christmas Day just a couple of years ago. And at the same time that Nancy Pelosi and Kamala Harris were tweeting about the separation of families at the border, they had zero to say about Ronil Singh. And so I'd love it if there was a media moderator that would ask these Democratic presidential candidates, raise your hand if you know who Ronil Singh is.
Well, you've got so many great subjects that are covered in your book. I'm not sure we're going to hit them all, but you just referenced one, and there's some more. You talk in this whole Open Borders, Inc., right? This is a web, and we talked about sanctuary cities. Another factor in all of this, right, is the faith community. And I find it sometimes ironic that the faith community is complicit in allowing this illicit trade of people. Because again, it's, I think, in the false name of compassion, right, that somehow this is a good thing to be able to do. Can you talk a little bit about the Catholic Church, I think you mentioned in the book, the evangelical churches and that are a part of this whole network, sometimes wittingly, sometimes unwittingly, maybe for good purposes in their hearts, but at the end of the day, they're still a part of this endless human smuggling cycle.
Yes, I'm Catholic myself, and of course, over the years, I have become more aware that the Vatican and the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops are actively involved in subverting our borders. But I didn't know how deep and how many billions of dollars were at stake, many of them in the form of government contracts for the refugee resettlement racket. And in the case of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, exclusive subcontracts dealing with sheltering and paying for foster care for unaccompanied children, unaccompanied minors from south of the border in Central America. And what's alarming is that you've got many unwitting Catholics who are giving money to Catholic relief services or Catholic charities or the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, who don't understand that these organizations have been hijacked in some cases by social justice warriors, or it's in their DNA that they were in alliance with Saul Alinsky in Chicago. And so, we give money every Thanksgiving as part of a national campaign. And as I said before, people are under the impression that this is going and staying in their neighborhoods when it's being sent abroad. And then, it's like this vicious cycle. It's like this money laundering machine. And it's not just the Catholic Church. I talk about the Lutheran Immigrant and Refugee Services. This is one of the voluntary agencies, VOLAGs in the Beltway vernacular, that has one of these exclusive refugee resettlement contracts, and they're responsible for bringing Ilan Omar and her family here, and they're largely responsible for transforming the Twin Cities into the biggest breeding ground for jihad plots that are not only taking place here domestically, but of course many of these young men who were brought here in their toddler years or their early elementary school years, now going back to Somalia and killing their own people or targeting American soldiers. So I find it highly ironic that you have these liberal military leaders who published a piece in the Washington Post recently arguing against a more radical reduction of refugee resettlement numbers by saying that it would make us more unsafe because we need to import more Arabic translators from Afghanistan and Iraq back here. My answer to that is an appendix in Open Borders, Inc., which profiles 60 of what I call refugee jihadis, including at least 2 Muslim translators that were employed by the U.S. Army who were arrested, charged, or convicted of plotting jihad against America.
You know, you mentioned a little bit ago something else that caught my attention in your book, and something that struck me a little bit is about the funding of a lot of these entities that are out there, particularly on the left. George Soros, you mentioned him by name. He obviously spreads a lot of money around trying to push an agenda, I would argue a fairly radical agenda. And I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about his and or other wealthy donor forces that are impacting this debate.
Yes. So it's become verboten to talk about George Soros. He has many of his minions that are employed by groups like Media Matters or, the now defunct Think Progress, groups like this, that have labeled any criticism of George Soros' spending as anti-Semitism. And as you mentioned, I am the wife of the grandson of Ukrainian Jews, and yet this still doesn't insulate me from these ridiculous ad hominem charges. So the chapter that I wrote about George Soros is simply filled with facts about how the large bulk of his $25 billion net worth is now being directed toward the Open Society Foundations. $18 billion he has earmarked to achieve his agenda. And again, this is not conspiracy theory. I read his book called The Case for Global Governance, and he says that he considers sovereignty, quote, an obstacle to his goal of using the United Nations to achieve his own ends, whether they're for financial reasons or ideological reasons. And what's daunting is that for your informed, at least readers on my side of the ideological aisle, we know that he's involved in many high-profile groups that always become active during the electoral season. But there are hundreds and hundreds of them that proliferate with names that you don't even understand what they mean. The Abolish ICE movement in New York City, for example, has been perpetrated mostly by a group called Make the Road New York. I don't even know what that means, but they came out of nowhere to organize thousands of people to descend on the airports in New York City when Trump tried to introduce the travel ban, which was all centered on making sure that we don't have another 9/11. And there are numerous of these groups that then turn around and take their Soros grants and grant them to other organizations. I think it's really important for people to see just how many layers are involved here, and to make sure that in their own neighborhoods that they're doing their own homework about who's fomenting sanctuary cities, for example, or who's spearheading the drives for driver's licenses for illegal aliens or in-state tuition discounts. We talked about Montgomery County, Maryland, and Casa de Maryland basically has been a fiefdom in Montgomery County, and its political action arm, Casa in Action, endorsed the Montgomery County executive there, Mark Ehrlich. It's a cozy little network.
Well, I think you just articulated that very well. And I think one thing that might help for those who are viewing is to truly understand Open Borders, Inc. walking someone through the cycle of this human smuggling effort, right, that's at the center of it, that a family sitting in the Northern Triangle in Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, who are struggling, they've got some economic unrest, and they say, you know what, I'd like to go to America. And they're told, you know what, you don't have to come to the normal channels, just come up, you pay a fee, and then you'll get taken across the river, and then you'll be able to do whatever you want to do. And they're told that with some degree of honesty, right? Because what the cartels are saying, and some of the illegal organizations, they're saying, pay a fee. Now, what is that fee? Different people you talk to, it's something like $7,000. And so a family in the United States, a cousin or an uncle or an aunt, will pay the fee for somebody, or somebody back home will pay the fee. And then they'll bring somebody to the border. They'll pay coyotes, and it's an actual supply chain. There's a whole business model built around this. And they'll then take a video of somebody coming across the river, send the video back to the home family. Then sometimes they'll take a dad or a brother and they'll abuse them. And they'll take a video of the abuse, send it to them, and then ask for more money, more ransom. Then they'll get across the river. Then sometimes they're taken to some sort of stash house or something and then held for ransom. In the meantime, when they come across the river, as you pointed out, they go straight to Border Patrol because they know they're going to get caught and released. Because if you have a child under our current interpretation of the laws, I think it's a bad interpretation, it's your get out of jail free card, it's your automatic entry card, right? And so you get to come into the United States. So I could go on, but I think it's important for the American people, and I think you allude to this in the whole notion of Open Borders, Inc., that this is a whole system. It all ties together to do this and accomplish this to the detriment of our sovereignty and migrants who seek to come here.
That's right. And the fluency with which all of these players speak about this racket, the derecho de pisos, that premium that they pay to get across, knowing that al otro lado is right there, the binational phalanx of lawyers there to hold their Know Your Rights seminars. We talked about LexisNexis inside the ICE facilities.
Right.
And there's an appendix in Open Borders, Inc. that lays out all of those legal organizations and an entire army of what I call the illegal alien lawyers lobby. So when you have every law school that's recruiting and then every white shoe law firm that provides pro bono legal services, and then that's bringing cases all the way up to the Supreme Court, let alone the judicial tyrants, it's not just the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. I mean, and I understand that that's a great sort of shorthand for people signaling that they understand that there's a problem with the courts. But when you have, these individual circuit court judges just, unilaterally asserting authority to overrule the president's plenary powers on immigration, we have a systemic problem. And people ask me, well, what can I do? Well, one thing is to make sure that if you have the power to cast votes for district attorneys, that you're going to vote for a district attorney who is not going to look the other way at immigration law. And I think we should start impeaching some of these open borders judges as well.
Well, we could have a whole hour-long conversation on just that alone, given the extent to which those judges interfere with, I think, reasonable efforts by the administration to try to secure the border and Congress to make their stances. But that actually brings me to an important point here, which is the politicians right now, right? We've got a significant debate going on about the state of the border, what the president wants to do, is trying to do, ICE, Border Patrol. For the first 5 months of this year, my Democrat colleagues repeatedly said there was no crisis. It was a made-up crisis. It was a manufactured crisis. I'd go to the floor of the House and I would talk about the numbers of people, 100 and something thousand apprehensions in a month. And I'd be told, it's a manufactured crisis. Suddenly in the summer, it was, we got to admit there's a crisis. What do you see as the main problem here from a political standpoint, and how much have politicians are making it worse, and how much of the problem is politicians attacking law enforcement?
I think that the incitement to violence of the squad and pretty much every mainstream Democrat now is incredibly alarming. And I think that's why you're seeing these grassroots manifestations of support for ICE. The disingenuousness of all of these Democrats and certainly the presidential field on suddenly determining that a non-crisis was now a catastrophic event just speaks to the lack of any adults in the Democrat Party backrooms on this issue. And, you know, there used to be rational, sane voices on this. Barbara Jordan of your home state was, you know, a true heroine and patriot. And, you know, there isn't one Democratic presidential candidate who will stand up and say, you know, we shouldn't have Medicare for all illegal aliens. We should put American citizens first. We should really believe in this idea of securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity first. And I suppose of all of them, Tulsi Gabbard now has shown some glimmer of sanity on the issue. But when you have the head of the Democrat National Convention as someone, Thomas Perez, who used to head Casa de Maryland, the radical fringe has become the center of the Democrat Party.
Well, I'm glad you pointed that out. And, you know, as I think about the importance of your book right now and the timing of the subject matter, I'm really glad you mentioned the Medicare for all point, right? I mean, Milton Friedman, famous free market economist, was once asked, I believe in the 70s, whether he supported open borders. And he said, absolutely. Now, keep in mind, this is in a pre-9/11 world. But he said, absolutely, if you don't have a social welfare state.
Correct.
And that's an important point here, right? Because of the magnet. And it's important that we have sovereignty and that we have a way to manage all of this and the security of our citizens and that migrants have a safe way to come here. But I think that's an important point that you made with the Medicare for All, because every single Democrat candidate raised their hand. And if you think about what that magnet would look like and what that would do to upend our immigration system, the numbers that we've seen this year of almost 1 million would swell to untold numbers. Where do you think we go from here? What do you get out of this book, and what do you think we do to shape the narrative and what you're trying to accomplish with Open Borders, Inc.?
So people always ask, well, what do I do now? And for all 7, this is my 7th book that I've written, I've never intended my books to just become doorstops or for people to just read them and then these books to have the shelf life of French fries. I want them to last, and I want people to use the information. And so I'm trying to practice what I preach by going out there. I mean, I've seen so many brave people on the front lines for so long who haven't had the privilege of having a platform that I have. And so you can't let fear guide you. I also feel like if you can take small steps to do what you can to defund Open Borders, Inc., and you can start small. Some of these things are harder than others. I mean, if you don't want to support what Google is doing anymore, and you've got Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, all of whose employees have now essentially declared war on ICE. They're pressuring their CEOs to stop doing business, any business at all, with anyone who works at the Department of Homeland Security. Wean yourself off of those platforms. You know, MySpace doesn't exist anymore. And there was a point at which we all thought that it was going to rule the world. It no longer exists.
Right.
We don't have to yield and capitulate. And so, you know, I've even changed banks from a national chain that was embracing illegal immigration to a local bank in my hometown.
Right.
That's my first step. And then we have to lobby ourselves and raise our voices and pressure the people here in the swamp to do more to defund, for example, many of these nonprofit tax-exempt groups that are, I think, engaging in seditious behavior.
Well, Michelle, I appreciate your book. I appreciate the timing of it. I think we can solve this problem if we work at it. You know, I think we've got solutions that we've set in committees here on Capitol Hill. One-page bills that would solve the asylum problem. One-page bills that would solve the Flores catch and release problem. Funding ICE at the level President Obama asked of about $1 billion in order to deal with what we need to on the border to stop cartels. Labeling cartels as foreign terrorist organizations is a bill I introduced to do. But it just takes the resolve to do it. And I really appreciate you exposing, I think, this kind of network that's running against what the American people want, which is a rational, sane system built on the rule of law so that people can come here, really live the American dream, but do it safely according to our law. And I know you agree with that.
Amen. And I want to thank you. If we could clone you 434 times, that would go a long way, too. So thank you for your time. I know you're busy, and please keep doing what you're doing, Congressman.
Thanks, Michelle. God bless.
You too.
This program is available as a podcast. All Afterwards programs can be viewed on